Okay, let's unpack this. Have you ever stopped to really think about why the global stage looks the way it does? Why countries sometimes work together um, almost seamlessly.
And then other times they seem completely locked in conflict. Yeah.
Exactly. Are states just sort of self-interested actors grabbing for power, or there's something else going on?
Well, there are definitely lots of different ways to look at it, different lenses, competing ideas about what's really driving things.
And today, we're going to take a deep dive into one of the big ones, the theory of liberalism in international relations.
And we're doing this using the specific stack of sources you've shared with us. Think of this like a custom study session. Yeah. Tailored just for you. We'll guide you through the material, pull out the important bits.
Our mission really is to cut through some of that academic jargon you sometimes get with these theories.
Right. Get to the core of what liberalism actually suggests about how states, and people too, interact on the world stage.
The goal is to help you get a really solid handle on this topic. Understand its basic beliefs, look at the different flavors of it, and see how it might, explain stuff happening in the real world.
And it's really interesting to dig into liberalism because its starting point is just fundamentally different from other big theories, like realism, that's often seen as its main rival, intellectually speaking.
Yeah, realism tends to paint a picture of the world as, well, anarchic, dangerous, dominated by states just constantly scrambling for power and security. It's a bit bleak sometimes.
It can be. But liberalism, as we'll see, it starts from a completely different place.
Mhm.
It's rooted in a much more, shall we say, hopeful view of human potential and the possibility of progress.
It's that hopeful view of humanity that's really the foundation.
Absolutely, it's the bedrock. Liberalism begins with this core assumption about human nature, that humans, fundamentally, have strong cognitive capabilities. We can think, we can reason, learn, solve problems.
And that's not just a minor point, it's central.
Oh, completely central. It's the foundation the whole theory is built on. Unlike, perspectives that might focus on base instincts or just a relentless drive for power.
Right.
Now, liberalism isn't naive. It acknowledges self-interest exists. Of course it does. We are motivated by our own needs, our desires.
Sure.
But this is the key part. It argues that self-interest only drives behavior up to a point. It isn't the only thing, or even the main thing.
So what is the main thing according to liberalism?
The deeper urge, the more fundamental impulse for humans is actually to cooperate.
Huh. That's a pretty powerful idea. Our default setting is working together.
When given the chance, yes. When our ability to reason kicks in, the source material you share puts it quite bluntly, actually.
You're so...
It says, for liberalism's assumptions, man is basically a cooperative animal.
A cooperative animal. I like that.
And it's not just about being selfless either. The reasons for cooperating are layered. Yes, it's partly for the welfare of others, recognizing shared humanity. But crucially, we also cooperate for our own intellectual stimulation. Think about it, the buzz you get from solving a problem together, the insights from different viewpoints.
Yeah, the satisfaction of collaborative work.
Exactly. That intrinsic reward, that intellectual engagement through cooperation, that's a key driver the source points to.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense on an individual level. We see people collaborating all the time, science, arts, communities. But how does that translate to, huge things like nation states? That seems like a big leap.
It does, but that's where liberalism applies this view of human nature to the international system, specifically to the idea of the nation-state itself. So, unlike realism, which might see the state mainly as a tool for survival in a dangerous world.
Like a weapon, almost.
Kind of, yeah. Liberalism sees the nation-state itself as being based on cooperation. It's not just something imposed from the top down.
It grows from the bottom up, from that cooperative instinct.
In a way, yes. The liberal view sees the state evolving from a social contract. Not necessarily a literal signed document, but it's sort of agreement, maybe implicit, between people and the state they form.
Okay.
And because the state is made up of individuals, people who, remember, can think, reason, and lean towards cooperation, the state's own nature and actions are shaped by those individuals.
So the state isn't some separate beast, it reflects the people inside it.
Pretty much. And if those people are fundamentally cooperative,
Then the state they build will also tend towards cooperation.
that's the logic. And under this social contract idea, the state has a big responsibility to its citizens. Create conditions for them to grow, to flourish. Security, yes, but also education, opportunity, freedom.
Right.
And here's the crucial step onto the world stage. A state can only really guarantee those conditions for its own people if the world outside its borders is reasonably stable.
Ah, you can't flourish internally if there's constant war externally.
Exactly. You can't achieve that stability if states are constantly fighting each other. So the state's duty to its own people actually pushes it towards cooperating with other states.
So it's like enlightened self-interest, but for the whole country.
Precisely. And that leads to the core liberal vision, which is actually quite simple and powerful. If all states operate like this, recognizing their duty to their citizens, understanding cooperation is the best way to fulfill it, and if they all cooperate for mutual benefit and stability.
Then global peace becomes possible, maybe even likely.
That's the vision. Peace results naturally.
So interactions between states, then, are driven by seeing shared benefits. It's not a zero-sum game.
Exactly. Mutual interest is the basis for interaction. Cooperation isn't a sacrifice. It helps both sides. And the source material really flags the importance of international organizations here.
Like the UN, WTO, things like that.
Yep. They provide the platforms, the rules, the meeting places for states to find and act on those mutual interests.
And does this create a kind of positive cycle?
That's the idea. Interaction based on mutual interest builds peace. And as states interact more and more deeply,
They become more dependent on each other.
exactly, interdependency grows. Economies get tangled up, societies connect, challenges become shared.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting, because a realist might look at that interdependence and see vulnerability, more ways things can go wrong.
Right, more points of friction or leverage.
But liberalism sees it differently, as a force for peace.
Absolutely. The source really emphasizes this. When states become deeply interdependent, the cost of conflict just skyrockets.
Because war would break everything.
Pretty much. Military action, trade wars, they risk shattering that whole network of connections and benefits that took time to build. States start to realize that the gains from cooperation, the benefits of interdependence, which help their own people grow and prosper, are way more valuable than anything they might gain from fighting.
The disruption is just too expensive economically, socially.
Prohibitively expensive. So the
Yeah.
more connected and modern states become,
The more they cooperate, and the less likely war becomes.
that's a key thread.
Mm.
Modernization drives integration, and integration drives peace. So if we just quickly recap the core liberal principles from the source, it's about human reason, freedom, cooperation, peace, progress, mutual interest driving things, modernization helping, and liberal democracy being the sort of government that embodies all this.
Okay, that lays out the core vision really clearly. But the source also mentions an evolution, right? A sort of sub-school that builds on this.
Yes, it introduces neoliberalism. Now, it's important to get this straight. Neoliberalism doesn't throw out those core liberal ideas we just talked about.
It accepts them.
It accepts them as the starting point, yeah. But the source describes neoliberalism as being, well, less optimistic, less convinced that we can reach that really deep, seamless cooperation the early liberals envisioned.
A bit more pragmatic, maybe? More cautious?
That's a good way to put it. A more cautious application of liberal ideas to the messy reality of international politics.
And when did this neoliberal thinking start to emerge, according to the source?
It points to the period between roughly 1780 and 1850, and that timing is really important.
Why is that?
Because it overlaps heavily with the Industrial Revolution, a time of just massive technological change, economic upheaval, societal transformation, especially in Europe first.
Right. Incredible changes happening very fast.
Exactly. And the thinkers of that era were just blown away by what humanity could achieve through industry, through reason,
Yeah.
building things, innovating, changing the world.
It must have felt like anything was possible.
It fed right into the age of enlightenment, the age of reason. There was this powerful intellectual current saying human reason is primary. Humans are at the center of things, capable of understanding and shaping their own destiny.
So that reinforces the liberal idea of human capability.
Definitely. It boosted ideas about progress and linked to that capacity for reason, fostered a spirit of cooperation, maybe on a bigger scale, societal, international. It's fascinating, though, because the source also points out that classical realism was really taking shape during this same period.
Wow. So two opposing theories emerging from the same historical moment.
Yeah, drawing different lessons from the same turbulent events. It really highlights how you can interpret things differently.
So neoliberalism comes out of this period, holding on to the core belief in human capacity and cooperation, but maybe looking more closely at the practical challenges of making it happen globally.
That's a good summary. And the source material you gave us actually breaks this down further into 4 specific types or schools within neoliberalism.
Okay, let's get into those. What's the first type?
Type A is called interdependency theory, and the source says it takes flight from classical realism, which is interesting phrasing.
What does that mean, flight from?
It means it doesn't just ignore realism, it engages with a realist focus on how states interact. But where realism sees that interaction leading mostly to competition and power struggles.
Interdependency theory sees something else.
It sees interaction based on shared mutual interests, leading ultimately to cooperation.
So it agrees states interact a lot, but disagrees on the usual outcome.
Precisely. The argument is, as states and societies interact more through trade, shared problems, cultural stuff, these interactions increasingly happen because both sides see a benefit, mutual interest.
Okay.
And critically, as this interaction deepens over time, it creates significant interdependence. Economies get linked, supply chains cross borders, people travel and talk more.
And we're back to the cost of conflict idea.
We are. The source emphasizes again that this interdependence can become so strong that when conflicts do pop up, because they still will, states have a really strong reason to find peaceful solutions instead of going to war.
Because breaking those links hurts too much.
Right. The potential damage to those valuable interdependent relationships just outweighs whatever they might gain from fighting. They value the cooperation, the mutual interests, more highly.
Does the source link this to specific thinkers?
Yes, it mentions Robert Keown and Joseph Nye, especially their work on complex interdependence theory back in the 1970s.
What do they add?
They provided a more detailed framework. They argue that as societies modernize, they get integrated in multiple ways, not just government to government, but also through companies, NGOs, other transnational actors.
So it's a more complex web of connections.
Exactly, complex interdependence. And in that kind of world, they argued, traditional military power becomes less useful, less relevant sometimes. States are more likely to negotiate, use non-military skills, because that interdependence is so valuable.
And the end goal, according to this theory.
The ultimate aim, or at least the direction it points towards, is that this kind of deep cooperation driven by interdependence could potentially lead to a conflict-free world.
Okay, so interdependency theory is about the network of connections that interaction builds. What's type B?
Type B is the institutional liberal mechanism. The name kind of gives it away. This perspective focuses heavily on international organizations.
The UN, WTO, NATO, again, formal bodies.
Exactly those. They're seen as the key tools for getting states to cooperate, especially when it might be tricky otherwise.
Why would states need these institutions? Why not just cooperate directly?
Well, the source points to a key reason: fear. Specifically, the fear that other states won't hold up their end of the bargain. Fear of non-compliance.
Ah, the trust issue. If I cooperate but you cheat, I lose out.
Precisely. In a system without a world government, how do you trust others? Institutions help bridge that gap. They provide rules, frameworks, ways to monitor what others are doing, platforms for talking things through.
They build confidence.
They foster cooperation and build confidence, yes. The source suggests that even if states are a bit reluctant at first, just participating within the institution, sharing goals, working on projects, seeing results can gradually make them more likely to follow the rules and international laws over time.
So the institution itself kind of nudges them towards being more cooperative.
That's the idea. It's sort of socialization process. Plus, these platforms offer established ways to handle disputes peacefully. It makes it easier, more predictable, to work through disagreements without resorting to conflict. They lower the costs of cooperating and raise the costs of cheating.
Okay, so type A, interdependence from interaction. Type B, institutions as tools for cooperation. What's type C?
Type C is sociological liberalism. This one takes a broader view. It argues that looking only at state-to-state relations gives you an incomplete picture of international relations.
It's not just about governments talking to governments.
Definitely not. Sociological liberalism says we need to study a much wider range of actors. Different people, groups, civil society organizations, multinational companies, even individuals.
Anyone acting across borders?
Pretty much. It stresses pluralism, the idea that within any country there are lots of different actors with different interests, and their interactions across borders matter too. It gives international relations a more, well, plural character.
And globalization must supercharge this, right?
Yeah.
All these non-state actors interacting constantly.
Exactly. All this interaction among transnational actors creates a huge boost in integration, not just between governments, but between societies.
Societies connecting directly.
Yeah. And the source brings up Carl Deutsch here. He studied the impact of rising communication and transaction, CNT, between peoples and societies.
Communication and CNT. What does that cover?
Think tourism, trade between businesses or people, not just state deals,
Hmm.
migration, cultural exchanges, information flows. Basically, any way people and groups connect and do things across borders.
Okay.
Deutsch argued that societies with more of this interaction, more transactions, see their CNT levels rise.
And what does higher CNT lead to?
According to Deutsch, it leads to greater unification between those societies. They develop shared understanding, familiarity, maybe even a sense of community.
Like the interdependence idea, but more at the people level?
Similar effect, yeah. And like interdependence, this unification matters when conflict looms. If societies are deeply linked through all this communication and transaction, they become really reluctant to sacrifice those beneficial connections.
They value the relationship itself.
Exactly. The cost of war becomes too high at the societal level because it disrupts all those valuable exchanges. So unified societies push for peaceful conflict resolution.
Okay, interdependence via states, institutions as tools, societal connections. What's the fourth and final type of neoliberalism?
Type D Republican liberalism. This one zooms in on the internal politics of states, specifically the link between democracy and peace.
Ah, the democratic peace theory idea that democracies don't fight each other.
That's a central part of it, yes. Republican liberalism argues that democratic societies have certain features that make them inherently more peaceful, especially towards other democracies.
Like what features?
Things like transparency in government, open decision-making, the rule of law, leaders being accountable to the people through elections. Because of these things, democracies are seen by other democracies as more predictable, more reliable, more likely to follow rules.
Okay, but the source asks the big question. But do democracies fight wars? Because clearly they sometimes do.
Right. And the source gives that nuanced answer. At once, both yes and no.
How can it be both?
The no part is the core democratic peace claim. Democracies, the theory argues, just don't fight wars amongst themselves. Their shared values, their ways of resolving disputes peacefully at home, their transparency, it stops them fighting other states built on the same principles.
Okay, so peace between democracies. That's the no. What's the yes?
The yes explains who they do fight and why. Republican liberalism suggests that democracies do view non-democratic regimes, dictatorships, authoritarian states as a serious threat.
Why is that?
It goes back to those democratic characteristics. Dictatorships lack transparency. Decisions can be secret, sudden, unchecked. This makes democracies feel vulnerable, unable to trust or predict what the dictator might do. The source calls it susceptibility to dictators' political whimsicalities.
The unknown is scary. The lack of openness breeds suspicion.
Exactly. That non-transparency is seen as a fundamental threat to the stable, predictable, rule-based world that democracies prefer. And if that threat feels serious enough,
Democracies might act.
according to this theory, yes. The source says they might take resort to replacing these dictator regimes.
Replacing them, like regime change.
That's the implication. The stated goal within this framework would be to install leaders or systems more aligned with democratic norms, international rules, their own policies. It's framed as nation building, promoting democracy to ultimately create long-term peace by expanding the democratic zone.
That sounds interventionist. Does the source mention how far they might go?
It does. It says, in pursuit of this goal, removing the threat, building democracy, they might even go so far as to install puppet governments.
Wow, okay. That's presented as a way to achieve long-term peace in the region.
That's how the source presents the logic within this specific theoretical viewpoint, yes, as a potential, if extreme, tool for Republican liberal aims.
That definitely highlights some very complex and potentially controversial applications of the theory.
Absolutely. And the source is very careful to add a crucial warning right after mentioning this.
What's the warning?
It says basically that this may not always have the desired results, leading to more conflicts and global unrest in some cases. It directly acknowledges that trying to impose democracy or change regimes, even with good intentions, can backfire badly. It can make things worse, not better.
So across these four types, interdependency, institutional, sociological, Republican, we see different angles, but they all circle back to that core liberal idea that cooperation is possible, it's beneficial, and there are different ways it can happen, potentially leading us away from constant conflict.
Exactly. Different mechanisms, different focuses, but all building on those foundational liberal beliefs. And the source kind of wraps up the broader neoliberal view on world order itself.
How does it summarize that?
It says pretty clearly that for neoliberals, world order comes from interaction among states and other actors, not, as the realists would argue, primarily from the balance of power.
Interaction and cooperation create order versus power and competition creating order. That's a huge difference.
It really is fundamental. And this neoliberal lens also affects how you see big global problems. Things like, climate change, international drug trafficking, flows of illicit money.
Problems that ignore borders.
Exactly. And the neoliberal take is that no single country, no matter how powerful, can solve these alone.
Okay.
Their own resources are just too limited for such huge, complex issues.
So they have to cooperate.
They must.
Yeah.
The solution requires states, and maybe others, to interact, coordinate, build a global consensus to tackle these shared threats together. The source adds a couple of conditions for this, though.
What are they?
First, states need to figure out and prioritize their own national interests in relation to the problem. And second, they need transparent decision-making, ideally democratic, to reach agreement on those priorities and how to act collectively. It shows the challenge of getting everyone on the same page.
Okay. Before we hit the case study, the source uses that classic analogy, John Burton's billiard ball model from '72, to contrast realism and liberalism. How does that work?
It's a great visual. Burton used it to show how the theories picture the world. For realism, the world is like a billiard table. States are the balls, solid, separate, self-contained units. They bounce off each other, sometimes collide, but they're fundamentally independent.
Hard shells moving on their own paths.
Right. But the liberal view, especially drawing on the sociological and interdependency ideas, is totally different. It's not neat billiard balls. It's a complex mosaic of multiple actors.
More like a web or a network.
Exactly, a dense, tangled web. States, groups, individuals, all interacting deeply, integrating, cooperating. The lines between them are blurry. They're constantly shaping each other. It's much more interconnected.
That really drives home the difference separate units versus complex relationships.
It does. And now, to see how these ideas might apply or how they can be used to interpret real events, the source gives us that case study, the U.S. invasion of Iraq.
And how does the source connect that event specifically to liberalism? It seems more like a realist power play on the surface.
Well, the source explicitly analyzes it through the lens of Republican liberalism type D. It presents the situation as fitting that pattern. A democracy, the U.S., identifying a threat from a non-democratic dictatorial society, Iraq under Saddam Hussein.
Following that logic that dictatorships are inherently threatening because they aren't transparent.
Exactly that Republican liberal idea. The source lists the specific fears and reasons cited by the U.S. at the time, framing them within this theory. Things like fear of deception due to Iraq's non-transparency, concerns about past use of chemical weapons, the growing fear about potential WMDs, the belief Iraq would deceive inspectors.
So these fears, amplified by the dictatorial nature of the regime, were seen as justification for action under this specific liberal framework.
That's how the source frames the justification presented at the time, yes. It states that these perceptions compelled the U.S., according to this view, to invade, the stated goal. Remove the dictator, secure peace regionally and maybe globally by eliminating that perceived threat.
And the actions after the invasion.
Also presented as fitting the Republican liberal model. Efforts towards promoting democracy, nation-building in Iraq, trying to replace the dictatorship with the democracy to get that long-term stability and peace.
So the source analyzes the stated rationale and the follow-up actions as an attempt to apply Republican liberal principles.
That is precisely how the source lays out the framing through the Republican liberalism typology. But, and this is absolutely crucial, the source immediately follows this by discussing the actual long-term outcomes.
And what does it say about those?
It states very clearly, based on its analysis, that applying this approach in Iraq ultimately led to increased unrest regionally. It mentions territory being compromised by factional fighting, ongoing instability, and globally. The source suggests it contributed to the rise of fanaticism and terrorism.
Wow. So the real-world result, as reported in the source, was basically the opposite of the intended outcome described by the theory.
Right. It serves as a stark illustration of that caveat we mentioned earlier, that trying to forcefully change regimes or impose democracy, even if the theory suggests it leads to peace, can seriously backfire. It can create more conflict and instability.
So the source uses the case study to show both theoretical justification, as it was argued, and the deeply problematic real-world consequences that followed. It highlights the gap between theory and messy reality.
Exactly. It shows the theory's logic, but then presents the complex, often negative outcomes, essentially demonstrating the limits and potential dangers when these ideas hit the ground, echoing the source's own earlier caution.
That's a really powerful way to examine how a theory tries to explain something like war, and how reality can diverge so sharply. We've definitely covered a lot of ground today, really digging into this major IR theory.
We have indeed. We started with that core liberal belief in human reason, the drive to cooperate, and how that scales up to states via the social contract, pushing them towards cooperation for their own citizens' welfare.
Then we moved into neoliberalism, building on the core ideas, but maybe a bit more cautious, emerging from that whole Industrial Revolution context.
And we broke down its four main types. Interdependency, where interaction makes conflict too costly. Institutional liberalism, focusing on organizations as tools for cooperation. Sociological liberalism, looking beyond states to people connections. And Republican liberalism, linking democracy and peace, but with those tricky interventionist aspects.
We contrasted the neoliberal idea of order through interaction with the realist view of order through power balance the billiard balls versus the mosaic, and touched on global problems needing cooperation.
And wrapped up with the Iraq case study, as presented by the source, showing how Republican liberalism was used to frame the action, but then critically highlighting the difficult negative outcomes reported, showing the theory's real-world challenges.
It's been a fascinating journey through a really influential way of thinking about how the world works. We've gone through the source material you provided, pulled out the key arguments on liberalism and neoliberalism as they're presented there.
Absolutely. It gives you a valuable lens, one perspective among several, for analyzing what's happening on the global stage.
So now it's over to you, listening. Having taken this deep dive, thinking about that core belief in cooperation, the different neoliberal mechanisms, interdependence, institutions, societal links to democracy, and reflecting on the mixed results like the Iraq case, what aspect of human nature or state interaction do you think is the most powerful force shaping international relations today? Is it cooperation, power, internal politics, something else entirely? Definitely something to chew on as you watch events unfold.